Hello, this is Gail Bird from gailbird.com, and today I'm showing you some soldering and forming techniques for wire earrings. This is an 18 gauge copper wire and it's totally bare. I usually use coated wire, but that doesn't work for soldering, so this is a bare solid copper wire. It took me a few tries to get the best way to work with these oval mandrel pliers, but basically you want to wrap the wire around the size mandrel you want in order to make a spiral out of it. Then you use your flush cutters to cut the spiral apart into rings. Note that I'm flipping the pliers each time to get the flattest cut possible on each cut end. And then I actually recut the pointy end before continuing to the next ring to make sure that they're as close as possible. The better your flush cutters, the easier this is going to be for you. And if you don't have ultra flush cutters like these ones, like if you cut and it makes it pointy no matter what side you're using, either get better cutters, which I totally recommend, or use a jeweler saw. Make the ends line up and then use an equalizing file. It's the square one with the flat sides, the even sides, to file down the join by forcing the file between the two ends where they meet. Keep the ends as close together as possible while you file. Thinner file than I have would actually do a better job of making a perfect join, but you use what you got. You can also open the rings and file each one separately, but I find it more difficult to get a perfect join that way, so I file it flat and closed. Shape the rings to make sure that they're closed perfectly. Check it from all angles, and you'll probably need to spring the ring back and forth to get the ends to line up. Next up, we're going to solder these rings closed. I like to use paste solder because it uses its own flux. It's got the flux in the syringe with it, and it's really easy to work with, and I'm super lazy, so that's what I like to use. I need to get some copper paste solder. This is silver paste solder. Because of the finish we're putting on it, doesn't really matter at this point. Use what you have. If you're going to use the little snips of silver wire or silver sheet solder, that's fine too. Just make sure that you flux your piece and the solder piece before you add the heat to it. So you want to make sure that you smush out way too much solder paste so that you waste a bunch, and then add a small amount to each join. Generally, you would just pop it right on from the syringe is what I'd usually do, but this went a little bonkers on me. Place the rings onto a safe soldering surface. My surface is a kiln brick inside a baking pan on top of a metal surface, and there's a quench bucket inside the pan as well. I use a small butane torch. It was kind of empty, so this is me filling it up, and it's just a can of butane from the hardware store. My butane torch it's kind of broken. I think it's been clogged, so it's not getting filled properly, and the igniter is busted. So I'm having to use a separate lighting system, which is annoying. I've since bought a Dremel torch, and it is so delightful. It's a thinner flame. It's very strong. The igniter works. It's great. Heat the copper evenly and gradually focus the heat on the join. When the solder flows, it will flash a bright silver. Then hit it with a bit more heat to ensure that the solder flows completely and it's evenly distributed. I like to sort of flick the flame back and forth to make sure that I don't overheat. As you can see, this is way too much solder for these tiny joins, but I'm not very precise, and it's going to get covered with the patina, so I'm not too concerned. I like to solder in dim lighting because you can see the flame more easily. In the light, you can see the changing copper colors a little better. on camera at least. So when the copper flashes color, it's nearly time to focus on the join. Once all of your soldering is done, quench the rings in water. You'll be able to immediately touch the rings after quenching. Next, check all of your joins. Sometimes they don't work and you'll have to clean them, file down the solder, and try it again. But in this case, they were all fine. Use the pliers to reshape the rings if necessary. I'm using a heavy rubber mallet with a wood striking surface to do some work hardening and to flatten the rings without changing the wire structure. And because it's so heavy, there's not a lot of effort on my part. I just have to lift it and let it drop. Pop the rings into the pickle pot to clean all the oxidation off the surface and then rinse it in water. I used to use salt and vinegar pickle, but I have recently purchased commercial pickle granules, which you dilute with water. It works great. It's just in a little cheap $10 slow cooker. File down the solder joins and remove the excess solder as best you can. I don't have a bench pin, so I'm using this wooden folding shelf I got from the dollar store to raise the items up off the table and to have a surface to file against while leaving room for my hands. I'm using the needle file with a flat edge on one side and rounded on the other, and I flip it back and forth depending on if I'm filing the inside or the outside. It's for sure awkward to file without a bench pin, but it's doable. Now you'll want to clean and work harden these little guys, so I'm putting them into my tumbler with steel shot. I'm also including other rings that are circular, both copper and silver filled. Silver filled is 10% silver and the rest is a copper alloy. Add some water and a drop of Dawn dish soap and seal up the lid of the tumbler. My hands were hurting, so I'm using a wrench here, but that's not actually necessary most of the time. Leave the rings in the tumbler for about an hour and check on it. It might need another hour, but you'll know when you see. They'll come out super shiny and they're clean and they're strong, and I love tumbling them. Use a fine mesh strainer, dump out the shot in the rings, and then rinse it in the sink. You pull out the rings and then the strainer just makes it easy to refill the tumbler with the shot. Use a ball peen hammer or any other texturing hammer to add a texture to one side of the rings. In this case, I'm using a metal hammer with a metal striking surface. That's to ensure that I do change the wire structure versus wood and the rubber mallet. Do not ever put your fingers onto the anvil block. That is a surefire way to hammer your fingers. I should definitely be holding these off the edge of the block, maybe even with a pair of pliers. But I did not. Luckily, I didn't smash my finger this time. Once all of my circles are all cleaned up, it's time to add some decoration and beads. Using a 22 gauge wire, and again this is the bare copper, wrap one edge tightly around the soldered ring 3 times. Add some swirly gigs and pop a bead or 2 on there. Here I'm using kyanite. Finish up by wrapping the other end 3 times. If you don't wrap tightly together, you'll get some nice texture later on with the finish. Cut down the wire if necessary, and make sure nothing is sticking out. The end result, when you add an ear wire, is a fabulous little earring. To the next video, I'll show the patina process.